Sometimes the hardest inheritances aren't the ones we receive, but the ones we must prove ourselves worthy of. At 80 years old, Violet Marlowe stood at a crossroads she never imagined facing. Her Uncle Barnaby had left her his mountain lodge in Silverpine Ridge. The locals laughed behind her back, saying she was too old and too soft for mountain life. But Violet came anyway with her border collie Finn by her side. The lodge was cold, and the snow seemed endless. Then one afternoon, Finn started digging near the foundation. He wouldn't stop until Violet came to see what he had found. Buried in the snow was something that would reveal a secret her uncle had kept hidden for decades. What had Uncle Barnaby been protecting all these years? Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, subscribe, because tomorrow I have something extra special for you. 3 days before Finn's discovery, Violet Marlowe had arrived at the lodge with nothing but a suitcase, a weary heart, and her faithful dog. The journey from the city had taken 8 hours, each mile carrying her further from the life she knew and deeper into a landscape that felt both familiar and foreign. She remembered these mountains from childhood summers spent here, but that was more than 60 years ago. Memory has a way of softening the edges of things, making them warmer and gentler than they truly were. The lodge stood at the end of a winding road that climbed steadily into the highlands of Silverpine Ridge. Snow blanketed everything in sight, transforming the world into something quiet and still. The building itself was larger than she remembered. 2 stories of weathered timber and river stone, with a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and several shutters hung at odd angles. Uncle Barnaby had lived here alone for 43 years, and the place showed every season of that solitude. Violet had parked her old sedan in what she assumed was the driveway. Though it was difficult to tell under 2 feet of snow, Finn had bounded out immediately, his black and white coat stark against all that white, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. He was 11 years old now, graying around the muzzle, but he still had the energy of a much younger dog. He'd been a gift from her late husband Gerald, given to her 2 years before Gerald's death. The dog had seen her through the worst of her grief, never asking for anything but her presence. The key had been waiting for her at the lawyer's office in town, handed over by a stern-faced clerk who looked at her with barely concealed pity. She'd felt the weight of that look, understood what it meant. An 80-year-old woman, widowed and alone, inheriting a mountain lodge she had no business trying to maintain. The sensible thing would be to sell it immediately, take whatever money she could get, and return to her apartment in the city. That's what her daughter Patricia had said on the phone. That's what her son Michael had agreed with during their brief, uncomfortable conversation. But Violet had come anyway. The inside of the lodge had been cold when she first stepped through the door, the kind of cold that settles into a place when no one has lit a fire or drawn a warm breath for weeks. Uncle Barnaby had died 6 weeks earlier in late January, during one of the heaviest snowfalls Silverpine Ridge had seen in years. The funeral had been small, attended by perhaps a dozen people, most of them looking uncomfortable in their dark coats and polite expressions. No one had spoken much about Barnaby himself. They'd offered the usual platitudes about his peaceful passing and his long life, but there was an emptiness to their words, as if they were talking about a stranger rather than a man who'd lived among them for 4 decades. Violet had stood at the graveside, feeling the sting of wind on her cheeks, wondering why she felt so disconnected from the moment. She had loved her uncle as a child, had treasured those summer visits when he would take her fishing in the nearby streams or teach her the names of wildflowers that grew in the mountain meadows. But time and distance had done their work. She'd stopped visiting in her 20s, caught up in her own life, marriage, children, the demands of work and family. The years had slipped away, and now he was gone. And all she had left was this place and the questions she'd never thought to ask. The first thing she'd done after arriving was to get the generator running. It had taken her the better part of an hour, reading the instructions Barnaby had left taped to the wall of the small shed out back. Her hands had been stiff with cold by the time she'd coaxed the old machine to life, but the sense of accomplishment had warmed her more than the thin jacket she wore. The generator powered the essential systems, lights, the well pump, a few outlets. The lodge had a wood stove in the main room and an ancient oil furnace in the basement, both of which she'd managed to start with varying degrees of success. That first night, she'd sat in her uncle's reading chair by the wood stove, wrapped in 2 blankets with Finn curled at her feet. The chair was worn smooth by years of use, the leather cracked and comfortable. On the mantelpiece above the stove sat a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses, folded neatly beside a small stack of books. She'd picked up the glasses, held them up to the firelight, and felt the weight of her uncle's absence settle over her like another blanket. The lodge was filled with traces of him. His coat still hung by the door, a heavy wool thing with patched elbows. His boots sat beneath it, caked with dried mud. In the kitchen, his coffee mug waited beside the sink, a faint ring of residue still visible inside. The refrigerator held nothing but a bottle of mustard and a jar of pickles, but the pantry was surprisingly well stocked with canned goods, rice, and dried beans. It seemed Barnaby had been preparing for a long winter, one he hadn't lived to see through. She'd explored the lodge slowly over those first 2 days, opening doors and drawers with the guilty feeling of an intruder. The upstairs held 3 bedrooms, all sparsely furnished. Her uncle's room was the largest, with a simple bed, a dresser, and a writing desk positioned beneath a window that looked out over the mountains. The desk was neat, nearly empty. A few pens in a cup, a notepad with nothing written on it, a small wooden box that held buttons and paper clips, nothing that explained the man who'd lived here or why he'd chosen such isolation. The other 2 bedrooms appeared untouched for years, the beds made with blankets that smelled of cedar and thyme. One room had clearly been intended for guests, with a slightly better mattress and a braided rug on the floor. The 3rd room was smaller, almost monastic in its simplicity. Just a narrow bed and a single shelf holding a few old books with cracked spines. Violet had chosen the guest room for herself, unable to bring herself to sleep in her uncle's bed. She'd unpacked her few belongings, hung her dresses in the small closet, and arranged her medications on the bedside table. Arthritis medicine, blood pressure pills, the supplements her doctor insisted she take, the pharmacy of old age, all lined up in a neat row. Her hands ached more in the cold, the joints stiff and reluctant. Her knees protested every time she climbed the stairs. But she was still capable, still strong enough to do what needed to be done. On the 2nd morning, she'd walked into town. It was only 2 miles, a distance that would have been nothing to her 40 years ago, but now left her breathing hard and grateful for Finn's steady presence. The town of Silverpine Ridge was small, perhaps 300 residents if you counted the outlying farms. Main Street consisted of a general store, a post office, a cafe, and a handful of other businesses clustered around a central square. The buildings were old but well-maintained, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. She'd stopped at the cafe for a late breakfast, hoping for hot coffee and something warm to eat. The place was half full, locals sitting in groups of 2s and 3s, their conversation falling to murmurs when she walked in. The woman behind the counter, perhaps 50 years old with sharp eyes and a pinched mouth, had greeted her with a smile that didn't reach past her lips. "You must be Barnaby's niece," the woman had said, wiping down the counter with deliberate slowness. "Heard you'd come up to see about the lodge. That's ambitious of you." The way she said ambitious made it clear she meant something else entirely. Foolish, perhaps, presumptuous. Violet had ordered coffee and eggs, taken a seat by the window, and tried to ignore the glances from the other patrons. She'd heard the whispers, of course. It was impossible not to in a place this small, where voices carried and walls were thin. Poor thing. At her age. Doesn't know what she's getting into. That lodge needs work she can't possibly manage. Should sell it and go back where she came from. Violet had eaten her breakfast in silence. The eggs cooked perfectly but tasting like ash in her mouth. Finn had waited outside, tied to a post, and she'd brought him a biscuit wrapped in a napkin. They'd walked back to the lodge together, the dog ranging ahead and then circling back, always keeping her in sight. That afternoon, she'd called Patricia. Her daughter had answered on the fourth ring, her voice distracted and rushed. "Mom, how's it going up there? Are you settling in?" "I'm fine," Violet had said, staring out the window at the endless snow. "The lodge is bigger than I remembered." "It needs work. Have you thought about what we discussed? About selling?" "I've thought about it, and I'm not ready to decide yet." There had been a pause, heavy with unspoken frustration. "Mom, you're 80 years old. You can't spend a winter up there alone. What if something happens? What if you fall or get sick or—" "I have Finn," Violet had said, reaching down to scratch the dog behind his ears. "I'm not alone." Another pause. "I'm worried about you, I know. But I need to be here for a little while. I need to understand why Uncle Barnaby left this to me. He left it to you because you're family. That's all there is to it." But Violet had known, even then, that there was more to it than that. She'd felt it in the silence of the lodge, in the careful way her uncle had arranged his life. There was something here she was meant to find, meant to understand. She just didn't know what it was yet. On the third morning, she'd woken to fresh snow falling, soft and steady. The world outside her window was a study in white and grey, the mountains barely visible through the veil of weather. She dressed slowly, her joints protesting the cold, and made her way downstairs to start the coffee. Finn had been waiting by the door, his tail wagging with the eternal optimism of dogs, ready for whatever the day might bring. After breakfast, she'd bundled herself in her uncle's wool coat, too big for her, the sleeves hanging past her wrists, and stepped out onto the porch with Finn at her heels. The air was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that made her lungs ache with each breath. Finn had bounded down the steps and into the snow, delighting in the way it puffed up around him. That's when he'd started digging. At first, Violet had thought he'd caught the scent of some small animal, a mouse or vole, hiding beneath the snow. But he'd been focused on one particular spot near the foundation of the lodge, digging with single-minded determination. She'd called to him, but he'd ignored her, his paws working furiously, snow flying up behind him. Curious now, Violet had made her way down the steps and across the yard, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. Finn had dug down about 2 feet, and she could see something dark at the bottom of the hole, something that wasn't earth or stone. "What have you found, boy?" she'd asked, kneeling carefully beside the hole, her knees protesting the movement. Finn had looked up at her, his eyes bright with excitement, snow dusting his muzzle. Then he'd gone back to digging, and Violet had reached down to help, brushing snow away with her gloved hands, the edge of something wooden, old-weathered but solid, a chest. Her heart had begun to beat faster, a flutter of excitement mixing with apprehension. She'd looked back at the lodge, at the windows dark and watching, and wondered what her uncle had buried here and why. It took Violet nearly an hour to dig the chest free. Her hands ached with the effort, her back protesting each movement, but she worked with a determination that surprised her. Finn helped as much as a dog could, using his paws to scrape away loose snow, while Violet worked to expose the edges of the wooden box. It was larger than she'd first thought, perhaps 2 feet long and a foot deep, bound with rusted metal straps that had seen better days. When she finally managed to work it loose from the frozen earth, she sat back on her heels, breathing hard, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. The chest was heavy, solid. She tried to lift it, failed, then dragged it across the snow toward the porch steps. Finn danced around her, excited by this strange game, his tail wagging. Inside the lodge, with the chest positioned on the floor beside the wood stove, Violet studied it more carefully. The wood was dark with age and moisture, warped in places but still intact. The metal clasp was rusted shut, but after several minutes of careful work with a screwdriver from her uncle's tool drawer, she managed to pry it open. The hinges groaned as she lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in layers of oilcloth, were papers, letters mostly, bound together with lengths of twine that had aged to the color of old bone. Beneath them, a collection of photographs, their edges yellowed and curling, and at the very bottom, folded carefully, a hand-drawn map on what appeared to be surveyor's paper. The ink faded, but still legible. Violet lifted out the first bundle of letters with trembling hands. The oilcloth had done its work. The papers inside were dry, protected from the moisture that should have destroyed them long ago. She untied the twine carefully, mindful of how fragile everything seemed, and unfolded the first letter. The handwriting was her uncle's. She recognized it immediately. That careful, deliberate script he'd always used, each letter formed with precision. But the paper itself was old. The ink faded to a soft brown. She held it closer to the light from the window and began to read. "Dear Jay, I hope this letter finds you well. I've enclosed what I could manage this month. It isn't much, but I wanted you to know I haven't forgotten. Your daughter's medical bills must be a terrible burden, and if this helps even a little, then I'm grateful for the chance to give it." The letter was dated March 1982, more than 40 years ago. There was no signature, just her uncle's initials at the bottom. B.M. Violet set the first letter aside and picked up another from the same bundle. This one was dated June 1985. "Dear Jay, the roof work you mentioned sounds expensive. I've sent along what I could. Please don't hesitate to ask if you need more. I remember what it meant to have a roof over my head when I had nothing, and I won't forget that kindness." Another letter, dated 1991. "Dear Jay, I heard about your husband's accident. I can't imagine the worry you must be carrying. I hope this helps with the medical expenses. He'll recover. I'm certain of it." Strong people always do. Violet read through the entire bundle, her confusion growing with each letter. They were all written to someone identified only as Jay, and they all contained references to money sent, help given, quiet support offered. But who was Jay? And why had her uncle been sending money to this person for so many years? She set the first bundle aside and picked up another. These letters were addressed to T and covered a similar span of years. References to a farm that needed repairs, equipment that had broken down, children who needed school supplies. The same careful offers of help, the same quiet generosity. A third bundle addressed to D, a fourth to C, a fifth to M. 5 bundles in all, 5 recipients, decades of correspondence. And in every letter the same theme, her uncle offering help, asking nothing in return, always signing with just his initials. Violet's hands were shaking now, though whether from cold or emotion she couldn't say. She set the letters aside and picked up the photographs. The first showed a group of people standing in front of a rough cabin, snow piled high around them. The cabin looked barely habitable, one wall charred as if from fire. The people in the photo were bundled in heavy coats, their faces worn but smiling. She didn't recognize any of them. The second photograph showed a young man, thin and ragged, his face nearly lost behind a scraggly beard. He stood beside an older woman who had her arm around his shoulders, steadying him. The young man looked half frozen, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Something about his posture, the way he held himself, seemed familiar. Violet looked closer, studied the shape of his face beneath the beard, and felt her breath catch. It was her uncle. Uncle Barnaby, perhaps 40 years younger, looking like he'd barely survived something terrible. The third photograph showed 5 families gathered together, perhaps 20 people in all. Children and adults, arranged in front of what looked like a community hall. The photo was dated on the back, December 1975. Violet set the photographs down carefully and picked up the map. It showed the area around Silverpine Ridge, with various locations marked in her uncle's careful handwriting. The old schoolhouse, now abandoned. A property by the river. A farmhouse on the eastern ridge. A small house on the edge of town. 5 locations in all, each marked with a letter, J, T, D, C, and the same 5 letters from the bundles of correspondence. At the bottom of the chest, she found one more letter. This one unsealed and addressed simply, "To whoever finds this." Her hands were steadier now as she unfolded it, though her heart was beating hard in her chest. The date at the top was recent, January 2025, just weeks before her uncle's death. "To whoever finds this," the letter began. "I'm writing this because I suspect my time is growing short, and there are things that need to be said. even if no one is around to hear them. In the winter of 1975, I came to Silverpine Ridge with nothing. I was a drifter, a young fool who'd made poor choices and run out of options. I'd been traveling through the mountains when the blizzard hit, one of the worst this region had ever seen. I took shelter in an abandoned cabin, thinking I could wait it out. I nearly died there. 5 families found me. They had no reason to help a stranger, especially during such a crisis. The blizzard had destroyed homes, killed livestock, left the entire community struggling to survive. But they took me in anyway. They fed me, warmed me, nursed me back to health. They gave me work when I recovered, helped me get back on my feet. They asked for nothing in return. I made a promise then, though I never spoke it aloud. I promised that if I ever had the means, I would repay their kindness. Not just to them, but to anyone in need. I would do it quietly, the way they helped me, without expectation of recognition or gratitude. I kept that promise for 50 years. I worked hard, saved carefully, invested wisely. I lived simply so I could give more away. Every month, I sent what I could to those 5 families and their descendants. When they had needs, I met them. When they struggled, I helped. I never told them it was me. I never wanted them to feel obligated or uncomfortable. The 5 families were the Calloways, the Thorntons, the Reeves, the Daltons, and the Mercers. If you're reading this, you might wonder why I never told them directly, why I kept it all so secret. The truth is, they gave me my life back when they had every reason to focus on their own survival. That kind of gift can't be repaid with acknowledgement or ceremony. It can only be repaid with action, with a lifetime of quiet return. I'm old now and tired. I've done what I could. If there's anything left when I'm gone, I hope it finds its way to those families or their children. They deserve to know that their kindness mattered, that it echoed forward through all these years. I'm leaving this lodge to my niece Violet, because she was the only one who ever saw me as something more than an odd hermit on a mountain. When she was young, she visited me here, and she never judged me for the simple life I'd chosen. I hope she'll understand why I lived the way I did. I hope she'll know that some debts can never truly be repaid. But that doesn't mean we stop trying. With gratitude, Barnaby Marlowe. Violet read the letter twice. Then a third time, the words blurring as tears filled her eyes. She set the letter down carefully and sat back in the chair, her mind reeling. Uncle Barnaby, the quiet man she'd barely known, had spent 50 years repaying a debt of kindness. He'd lived alone in this lodge, working and saving and giving everything away to families who didn't even know it was him. Finn pressed his head against her knee, sensing her distress. She reached down to stroke his fur, grateful for his solid presence. She thought about the townspeople in the cafe, their whispers and pitying looks. They'd thought Barnaby was just an eccentric old man, a hermit with no connections to the community. But he'd been connected in ways they couldn't see, supporting people quietly, asking nothing in return. And now he'd left it all to her. Not just the lodge, but this burden of knowledge, this responsibility to understand and perhaps to carry forward what he'd started. Violet looked around the room, at the simple furnishings and worn floorboards, and understood for the first time why her uncle had chosen to live this way. Every dollar he didn't spend on himself was a dollar he could give to someone else. Every comfort he denied himself was a gift he could offer to families who needed it more. She picked up the map again, studied the 5 marked locations. These were the places where the families lived, or had lived. The Calloways, the Thorntons, the Reeves, the Daltons, the Mercers. 5 families who'd saved a young man's life 50 years ago and probably never thought of it again. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and steady, covering everything in a fresh layer of white. Violet sat by the fire with the letters spread around her, Uncle Barnaby's final message in her hands, and wondered what she was supposed to do with all of this. She was 80 years old, tired and aching, living in a lodge she'd planned to sell. But now she knew the truth, and knowing changed everything. She couldn't simply walk away. Not from this. Not from the legacy her uncle had spent his entire life building. But what could she do? She was an old woman in a place where she was neither known nor welcomed, holding the pieces of a 50-year-old promise that had been kept in secret. Finn whined softly, and Violet realized she'd been sitting motionless for nearly an hour, lost in thought. She stirred herself, folded the letter carefully, and placed it back in the chest with the others. Then she stood, her joints protesting, and walked to the window. The mountains rose up beyond the lodge, ancient and patient. Somewhere out there were the 5 families, or their children, or their grandchildren. People who had no idea that their ancestors' kindness had shaped a man's entire life. People who might be struggling now, just as their forebears had struggled during that long-ago winter. Violet pressed her hand against the cold glass and made a decision. She would find them. She would learn their stories. And somehow, she would finish what Uncle Barnaby had started. She didn't know how yet. Didn't know if she had the strength or the time. But she owed it to him to try. The chest sat by the fire, its secrets revealed, its burden now hers to carry. And for the first time since arriving at the lodge, Violet felt something other than uncertainty and doubt. She felt purpose. That evening, Violet sat at her uncle's writing desk with the hand-drawn map spread before her. She'd found a magnifying glass in one of the drawers, and now she used it to study the careful notations Barnaby had made beside each marked location. The ink was faded in places, but she could make out most of the words. The schoolhouse was marked with a simple J, 1975. The riverside property bore the notation T, Medical Clinic, 1983. The farmhouse on the eastern ridge read C, Renovations, ongoing. Each location had a story, a purpose, a connection to her uncle's quiet mission. Violet decided to start with the closest location, the old schoolhouse. According to the map, it was less than a mile from the lodge, accessible by a trail that wound through the woods. She would go tomorrow, weather permitting, and see what she could learn. That night she slept fitfully, her dreams filled with images of the young man in the photograph, her uncle as she'd never known him, desperate and nearly dead in a winter storm. She woke several times to the sound of wind against the windows and the creak of old timber settling in the cold. Morning came grey and still. The snow had stopped during the night, leaving the world buried under at least another 6 inches. Violet dressed warmly, layering on thermal underwear beneath her clothes, then pulling on her uncle's heavy coat and a pair of insulated boots she'd found in the mudroom. They were too large for her, but thick socks helped fill the space. Finn was eager to go out, his tail wagging with anticipation. She fixed them both breakfast, oatmeal for herself, kibble for the dog, and then they set out into the cold morning. The trail to the schoolhouse was overgrown and nearly invisible under the snow, but Violet could make out the general direction from the map. Finn ranged ahead, his nose down, following scents only he could detect. The walk was harder than Violet had anticipated. Her breath came in labored puffs, her legs aching with each step through the deep snow. But she pressed on, stopping every few minutes to catch her breath and check her bearings. After 40 minutes of steady walking, the schoolhouse came into view through the trees. It was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure with a bell tower and a wide front porch. But it was clearly abandoned, the windows dark, the yard overgrown with weeds that poked up through the snow. Or at least, it should have been abandoned. As Violet drew closer, she noticed something odd. The roof looked new, the shingles clean and evenly laid. The porch had been recently swept, the boards free of the accumulated debris you'd expect from a building left empty. And smoke, just a thin wisp of it, rose from a chimney on the eastern side. Someone was here. Violet approached slowly, Finn at her heels now, no longer ranging ahead. The dog's ears were forward, alert but not aggressive. They climbed the steps to the porch, and Violet knocked on the heavy wooden door, footsteps inside, slow and careful. Then the door opened, revealing an elderly man with white hair and weathered features. He looked at Violet with surprise, then at Finn, and his expression softened slightly. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice carrying the rough edges of age and a lifetime of outdoor work. "I'm sorry to bother you." Violet said, suddenly feeling foolish. "I'm Violet Marlowe. I inherited the lodge up the trail from my Uncle Barnaby. I was just taking a walk and saw the schoolhouse. I didn't realize anyone was here." The man's expression changed at the mention of Barnaby's name. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition perhaps, or surprise. "Barnaby's niece," he said slowly. "I heard someone had come to take over the lodge. I'm Howard Ellis. I'm the caretaker here." "Caretaker?" Violet glanced past him into the building. She could see a large open room with chairs arranged in a circle, tables along one wall, children's drawings pinned to a bulletin board. "I thought this place was abandoned." "It was for many years," Howard said. "But about 15 years ago, someone funded the repairs. New roof, new furnace, proper insulation. Turned it into a community center of sorts. My granddaughter runs an after-school program here 3 days a week. Keeps the local kids busy and out of trouble." "That's wonderful," Violet said. "Who funded it?" Howard shrugged. "No one knows. The money came through a lawyer down in the valley. Anonymous donor, they said. Enough to fix the place up proper and cover operating costs for years. My granddaughter Emma, she's been trying to figure out who did it, wants to thank them. But whoever it was, they wanted to stay hidden." Violet felt her pulse quicken. "When did the donation come through?" "Do you remember?" "Spring of 2010, I think. Maybe 2009, around then." Violet did the math quickly. That would fit with the timeline in her uncle's letters. "Mr. Ellis," she said carefully, "did my uncle ever come here? Visit the schoolhouse?" Howard's eyes narrowed slightly, thoughtful. "Barnaby came by once or twice years back. Quiet fellow. Never said much, just looked around like he was checking on something." "Why do you ask?" "I'm trying to understand him better," Violet said, which was true enough. "He lived up here for so long, and I barely knew him. I'm just curious about what his life was like." Howard nodded slowly. "He was a good man, your uncle. Kept to himself mostly, but always polite when you saw him. In town, we didn't know each other well, but I respected him." "Did he know your granddaughter?" "Emma? I don't think so. She moved here after her parents died, about 12 years ago. I've been raising her since she was 16. She's 28 now, doing good work with these kids." He paused, studying Violet with an assessing gaze. "You planning to stay at the lodge? Folks in town seem to think you'll sell and leave." "I don't know yet," Violet admitted. "I'm still trying to figure things out." "Well, you're welcome to visit the center any time. Emma's here Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday afternoons. She'd probably enjoy meeting Barnaby's family." Violet thanked him and turned to leave, but Howard called after her. "Mrs. Marlowe, if you find out who fixed up this place, I hope you'll let us know. It made a real difference in this community, having somewhere safe for the kids to go. Whoever did it deserves to be thanked." Violet nodded, unable to trust her voice, and walked back down the steps with Finn. As they made their way back through the woods, her mind was spinning. The schoolhouse was one of the locations marked on the map, marked with J. Could Emma be the J from the letters? Or was it her grandmother, Howard's late daughter? Either way, it was clear her uncle had funded the repairs. He'd taken an abandoned building and turned it into something useful, something that helped children and brought the community together. And he'd done it anonymously, asking for nothing, just as he'd promised. Back at the lodge, Violet spread the map out on the desk again and studied the other marked locations. The riverside property where a medical clinic now stood. The farmhouse, the small house on the edge of town. Each one represented another act of quiet generosity. Another family helped, another promise kept. She picked up the photograph of the 5 families gathered together. 20 people, maybe more, all smiling at the camera. These were the people who'd saved her uncle's life. Their children and grandchildren were still here, living in Silverpine Ridge, probably struggling the way everyone in small mountain towns struggled. And her uncle had been helping them all along, silent and steadfast, for 50 years. Violet felt the weight of it settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about understanding her uncle anymore. It was about honoring what he'd done, about making sure his legacy didn't disappear when the lodge was sold, or the truth remained buried. But how? She was one elderly woman with limited resources and no connections in this community. The townspeople saw her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong. She had no authority here, no influence. Just the contents of an old chest and a growing determination to do right by her uncle's memory. That afternoon, a knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. She opened it to find the woman from the cafe standing on the porch, holding a covered dish. "Brought you some dinner," the woman said, her smile bright but somehow cold. "Figured you might not have much up here. It's chicken casserole. Just heat it up when you're ready." "That's very kind," Violet said, taking the dish. "Thank you, Mrs. Henderson. Call me Louise." The woman's eyes flicked past Violet into the lodge, taking in the interior with undisguised curiosity. "How are you managing? This place must be quite a change from the city." "I'm managing fine," Violet said, keeping her tone polite but not inviting further conversation. "Well, if you need anything, you just let me know. We take care of our own here in Silverpine Ridge, even when folks are just passing through." The emphasis on passing through was slight but unmistakable. After Louise left, Violet set the casserole in the kitchen and returned to the map. She wouldn't let condescension or small-town politics distract her. Tomorrow, she would visit the riverside property, the one marked with T. She would continue following her uncle's trail, learning what he'd done, understanding who he'd helped, and somehow she would find a way to finish what he'd started. The next morning brought clearer skies and warmer temperatures, though warmer was relative at this altitude in late February. Violet woke early, her body aching from the previous day's walk, but her mind sharp with purpose. She decided to search the lodge more thoroughly before venturing out again. If her uncle had buried one chest of secrets, there might be more hidden somewhere in the house. She started with his bedroom, working methodically through the dresser drawers and closet. She found clothes, mostly, worn work shirts, heavy pants, thick socks, a shoebox containing old receipts and warranty cards for long-dead appliances. Nothing revealing. The writing desk proved more interesting. In the bottom drawer, beneath a stack of unused stationery, Violet discovered a false bottom, a thin piece of wood that lifted out to reveal a hidden compartment below. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. Violet carried the ledger to the desk and opened it carefully. The pages were filled with her uncle's precise handwriting, organized in columns with dates, names, amounts, and brief notes. She recognized it immediately as a record of his charitable work, detailed and meticulous. The first entry was dated March 1976. Just months after the blizzard that had nearly killed him. J. Calloway, 200, roof repairs after winter damage. Family struggled since husband injured in rescue efforts. The entries continued month after month, year after year. Sometimes large amounts, sometimes small, always with a note explaining the reason for the help. Medical bills, farm equipment, school supplies, emergency repairs, groceries during hard times. Violet ran her finger down the columns, watching the years accumulate. 1976, 1980, 1985, 1990. The amounts grew larger as time passed, suggesting her uncle's financial situation had improved. The names remained consistent. J. Calloway, T. Thornton, D. Dalton, C. Reeves, Monsieur Mercer. The 5 families, appearing over and over, generation after generation. Some entries made her eyes sting with tears. T. Thornton, $15,000, medical expenses for grandson, cancer treatment. Family may lose farm to pay bills. D. Dalton, $8,000, replace pickup truck destroyed in accident. Only means of getting to work. C. Reeves, $3,500, bakery equipment after fire. Insurance insufficient. The pattern was clear. Her uncle had been watching these families, aware of their struggles, stepping in quietly whenever they faced crisis. And he'd recorded everything, not out of pride or a desire for recognition, but simply to keep track, to make sure no need went unmet. The final entry was dated December 2024, just weeks before his death. Emergency fund established, $400,000 in uncashed investment dividends, to be distributed to the 5 families upon my death. Instructions left with attorney. Violet will know what to do. Violet sat back, her hand trembling as she held the ledger. $400,000. Her uncle had accumulated that much through careful saving and investment, and he'd never spent a penny of it on himself. He'd lived in this drafty lodge with its leaking roof and ancient furnace, working until he was too old to work anymore, saving every cent so he could give it away. And now he'd left it to her, trusting that she would understand, that she would honor his wishes. She closed the ledger carefully and stood, her mind racing. She needed to find these families, needed to understand who they were now, what they needed. The lawyer must have the money, but how would it be distributed? Did the families even know about it? Violet decided she needed more information. The town library seemed like the logical next step. If Silverpine Ridge was like most small towns, the library would have local history, old newspapers, records of births and deaths and marriages. She could trace the 5 families through the years, find out who was still here, who had moved away. The library was a small brick building near the center of town, its windows glowing with warm light when Violet arrived an hour later. Vin waited outside, tied to a bench, while Violet pushed through the heavy door. Inside, the space was quiet and surprisingly well-maintained. Rows of books lined the walls, and several reading tables occupied the center of the room. An elderly woman sat behind the circulation desk, her white hair pulled back in a neat bun, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up as Violet approached, and her face brightened with recognition. "You must be Barnaby's niece. I heard you'd come to take over the lodge. I'm Susan Fletcher, the librarian here." "Violet Marlowe," Violet said, offering her hand. "I'm trying to learn more about the town's history. I was hoping you might have some old newspapers or records I could look through." "Of course," Susan said, standing. "We have quite a collection. What time period are you interested in?" "The winter of 1975, Violet said. "Particularly the blizzard." Susan's expression shifted, becoming distant with memory. "I remember that winter. I was in my 20s then, newly married, living with my husband's family on their farm. The blizzard lasted 3 weeks. We lost power for most of it, had to melt snow for water. Several people died, exposure mostly or accidents trying to get help. It nearly destroyed this community." She led Violet to a back room, lined with filing cabinets and boxes. "The newspapers from that year are on microfilm, but we also have hard copies of some special editions. The town did a commemorative issue 10 years later, interviewing survivors, documenting what happened." Susan pulled out a large bound volume and carried it to one of the reading tables. "This might be what you're looking for." Violet sat down and opened the volume. The first page showed a photograph of Silverpine Ridge, buried under massive snowdrifts, cars and buildings, barely visible beneath the white. The headline read, "10 years later, remembering the blizzard of 75. She turned the pages slowly, reading accounts of families trapped in their homes, of desperate attempts to reach neighbors, of livestock freezing in their barns. And then, on page 7, she found what she was looking for. Local families band together to save stranger. The article told the story of a young man, unnamed in the text, who had been found nearly frozen to death in an abandoned cabin on the edge of town. 5 families had worked together to save him, taking turns caring for him, sharing their limited resources even though they were all struggling themselves. The article listed the families: John and Margaret Calloway, Thomas and Ruth Thornton, David and Ann Dalton, Charles and Helen Reeves, Martin and Lillian Mercer. Violet's heart raced as she read the names. These were the people who had saved her uncle. She looked at the photographs that accompanied the article, group shots of the families, individual portraits. She recognized the faces from the photograph in the chest, but now she had names to go with them. The article concluded with a quote from John Calloway. "We didn't think about it, really. We just did what neighbors do. You help when someone needs help. That's all there is to it." Simple words, but they had shaped her uncle's entire life. Violet spent the next 2 hours in the library, tracing the 5 families through census records, obituaries, and local directories. She learned that John Calloway had died in 1998, his wife Margaret in 2003. Their children, 2 daughters and a son, had stayed in the area. The son, James, now ran the general store in town. Thomas Thornton and his wife Ruth had owned a farm on the eastern ridge. Thomas died in 2010. Ruth in 2015. Their grandson was listed as the current property owner. David Dalton and his wife Anne were both deceased, but their daughter still lived in Silverpine Ridge. Working as a nurse at the small medical clinic by the river, Charles and Helen Reeves had run a bakery in town. Helen had passed away in 2018. Charles had died just last year. Their daughter and granddaughter had kept the bakery running. Martin and Lillian Mercer were the hardest to trace. They'd left Silverpine Ridge in the late 1980s, relocating to a nursing facility 2 counties away. Lillian was still alive, according to a recent obituary for her husband that mentioned her as the surviving spouse. Violet copied down all the information she could find, filling several pages of a notebook Susan had provided. As she worked, the librarian brought her tea and sat nearby, watching with curiosity. "May I ask why you're researching these particular families?" Susan asked eventually. Violet hesitated, then decided there was no harm in sharing part of the truth. "My uncle knew them. I'm trying to understand his connection to this community." Susan nodded slowly. Barnaby was an interesting man. He lived here for 40 years, but most people felt they never really knew him. He kept to himself, didn't socialize much. But he was always kind when you did see him. Polite, respectful. She paused. He used to come to the library often. Back when we had, the next morning, while sorting through more of her uncle's belongings, Violet found a small wooden box tucked into the back of his nightstand drawer. Inside was a silver pocket watch, tarnished with age but still ticking steadily. She turned it over in her hands and found an inscription on the back. "Time repays all debts." The words struck her deeply. This must have been her uncle's personal reminder, a philosophy he'd lived by every day. Time hadn't just healed the debt he felt, it had allowed him to repay it slowly and carefully over 50 years. She slipped the watch into her pocket, wanting to keep it close. According to her notes from the library, the Thornton farm was on the eastern ridge, about 3 miles from the lodge. It was too far to walk, especially for someone her age, so Violet decided to drive. The road was snow-packed but passable, and her sedan handled it better than she'd expected. The farm appeared after 20 minutes of careful driving, a cluster of weathered buildings set against the rising slope of the mountain. The main house was a 2-story farmhouse with peeling paint and a sagging front porch. A barn stood nearby, its roof patched with mismatched shingles. Several pieces of farm equipment sat in the yard, half buried in snow, looking like they hadn't run in years. Violet parked near the house and climbed out with Finn. Before she could reach the porch, the front door opened and a man in his 40s stepped out, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" he called, his tone wary. "I'm Violet Marlowe," she said, approaching slowly. "I inherited the lodge from my Uncle Barnaby. I was hoping I could talk to you for a few minutes." The man's expression shifted slightly at the mention of Barnaby. "I'm Robert Thornton. This is my grandparents' place. Was, anyway. They passed some years back. What's this about?" "I'm trying to understand my uncle's connection to this community," Violet said carefully. "I found some records indicating he knew your grandparents, back during the blizzard of 1975. Robert's face softened. "The blizzard? Yeah, my grandmother used to tell stories about that winter. It was before I was born, but it shaped a lot of what happened to this family." He gestured toward the house. "You want to come in? It's cold out here." Inside, the farmhouse was cluttered but clean, with worn furniture and family photographs covering every available surface. Robert offered her coffee, which she accepted gratefully, and they sat at a kitchen table scarred by decades of use. "My grandparents were Thomas and Ruth Thornton," Robert said, setting a mug in front of her. "They owned this farm for 45 years. Good people, worked hard their whole lives. They told me about finding that young man during the blizzard, how he nearly died. Didn't know it was your uncle, though. They saved his life," Violet said. "He never forgot that," Robert nodded slowly. "My grandmother always said they just did what anyone would do. But things were tough after that winter. They lost most of their livestock, the barn roof collapsed, medical bills piled up. Took them years to recover." He paused, staring into his coffee. "And then, about 10 years ago, right when things got really bad, something strange happened." "What was that?" "My grandfather got cancer. Aggressive kind. The treatment was expensive, and we didn't have insurance that covered much of it. We were looking at selling the farm to pay the bills. Robert shook his head, the memory clearly still painful. But then someone paid them, anonymously, through a lawyer, $15,000. Just appeared in their account one day with a note saying it was from someone who wanted to help. Violet's hands tightened around her coffee mug. Did they ever find out who it was? No, the lawyer wouldn't say. My grandparents tried to refuse it at first, thought there must be some mistake. But the lawyer insisted it was real, that someone genuinely wanted to help. So they used it for the treatment. His voice grew thick. My grandfather lived another 4 years because of that money. Good years, too. Got to see me get married, meet my kids. I'm glad he had that time, Violet said softly. Robert met her eyes. You said you found records. Was it your uncle? Did he send that money? Violet hesitated, then nodded. Yes, he kept track of the families who helped him. When they needed something, he tried to help back. Robert sat back in his chair, his expression stunned. All these years we wondered. My grandmother died not knowing who'd helped us. He shook his head slowly. Why didn't he just tell us? We would have thanked him, tried to pay him back. I think that's exactly why he didn't tell you, Violet said. He didn't want gratitude or repayment. He just wanted to help. They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Finally, Robert spoke again. Things are tough right now. I'm trying to keep the farm going, but it's hard. The equipment's breaking down. The land needs work I can't afford. I've got a family to feed and bills piling up. Bank's been talking about foreclosure. He looked at her with something like desperation. I don't suppose your uncle left anything that might help. I hate to ask, but he did, Violet said, the words coming out before she'd fully thought them through. He left provisions for all 5 families. I'm still working out the details, but I promise you'll be taken care of. Robert's eyes filled with tears. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything. This is what my uncle wanted. After leaving the Thornton farm, Violet drove to the riverside property marked on the map. The medical clinic was a small, neat building with a sign that read, Silverpine Ridge Community Health Center. She parked and went inside. Vin waiting in the car. The waiting room was empty, except for a woman in scrubs sitting behind a reception desk, typing on a computer. She looked up as Violet entered, her smile professional but warm. Can I help you?
She asked. I'm looking for someone from the Dalton family, Violet said.
I was told one of them works here. The woman's smile widened. That's me. I'm Amy Dalton. How can I help you? Violet introduced herself and explained her connection to Barnaby. Amy's expression grew thoughtful as she listened. I remember your uncle, Amy said. He used to come to the clinic sometimes, years ago, when my mother ran it. Quiet man, always polite. I didn't know him well, but my mother spoke highly of him. She paused. My grandparents were David and Ann Dalton. They passed when I was young, but my mother told me they helped rescue someone during the blizzard of '75. Was that your uncle? Yeah. Amy leaned back in her chair, processing. This clinic exists because of that land. My grandparents owned this property, and after they died, my mother inherited it. She wanted to start a health center. The nearest hospital is 40 miles away, and people here need local care. But she couldn't afford to build. Then out of nowhere, someone donated the land specifically for medical use. No strings attached, just a requirement that it be used for community health. She gestured around the small space. My mother built this with grants and donations. It's been running for 20 years now. Did you ever find out who donated the land? No, it came through a trust, anonymous. My mother searched for years, wanting to thank whoever it was. Amy's voice softened. She died 2 years ago, cancer. She fought hard, but she shook her head. I took over the clinic after she passed. It's what she would have wanted. Violet felt the weight of her uncle's legacy settling more heavily on her shoulders. I think my uncle was the one who donated the land, she said quietly. Amy's eyes widened. Really, why would he do that? Because your grandparents saved his life, and he spent the rest of his life trying to repay that kindness. Amy sat in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she said, I wish my mother had known. She would have wanted to thank him. I think he would have preferred it this way, Violet said. But I wanted you to know, he never forgot what your family did for him. As Violet drove back to the lodge that afternoon, the pocket watch heavy in her pocket, she felt the enormity of what her uncle had accomplished. 2 families visited, 2 stories of quiet help given when it was needed most. And there were still 3 more families to find. The sun was setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the snow when she pulled up to the lodge. Finn jumped out eagerly, ready for his dinner. But as Violet climbed the porch steps, she noticed something that made her stop. The door was slightly ajar. She was certain she'd locked it before leaving. Violet's heart hammered in her chest. She reached down to hold Finn's collar, keeping him close, and pushed the door open wider. "Hello?" she called. "Is someone here?" No response. The lodge was silent except for the tick of the old clock and the settling of timber in the evening cold. She stepped inside carefully. Finn pressed against her leg, his body tense. The main room looked undisturbed at first glance. The fire had burned down to embers. Her uncle's chair sat where it always did. The chest was still beside the wood stove. But then she noticed the desk. The drawers were open, papers scattered across the surface. Someone had been searching through her uncle's things. Violet moved through the lodge room by room, checking to see if anything was missing. The bedroom was untouched. The kitchen seemed normal. But when she returned to the main room and looked more carefully at the desk, she realized several of the letters from the chest were gone. Not all of them. She'd made copies of the important ones and kept them in her bedroom, but someone had taken at least a dozen of the originals. Why? Who would want them? And how did they know about the chest? She locked the door securely and spent the rest of the evening trying to calm her nerves. Finn stayed close, protective and alert. She made dinner from the supplies in the pantry, canned soup and bread, and sat by the fire thinking. Someone in this town knew about her uncle's secret, or at least suspected there was something worth finding. But who? The next morning she decided to continue with her plan. She couldn't let fear stop her from finishing what she'd started. According to her notes, the Reeves family ran a bakery in town. She would go there next, learn their story, and try to understand if they knew anything about her uncle's help. The bakery was located on Main Street, a small shop with a cheerful blue awning and a hand-painted sign that read, "Reeves Family Bakery, Eston 1968. The smell of fresh bread met Violet as she pushed through the door, and her stomach growled despite having eaten breakfast just an hour earlier. A young woman in her late 20s stood behind the counter, arranging pastries in the display case. She looked up with a smile that seemed genuine, unlike the calculating expressions Violet had encountered from others in town. "Good morning," the woman said. "What can I get for you?" "Actually, I'm looking for someone from the Reeves family. I'm Violet Marlowe. I inherited the lodge from my uncle." The woman's smile widened. "I'm Sophie Reeves. This is my grandmother's bakery, though she passed last year. My mother and I run it now." She gestured toward a table by the window. "Would you like to sit? I can bring you some coffee and a scone, if you'd like to talk." Violet accepted gratefully, and soon she was seated with a steaming cup of coffee and a blueberry scone that melted in her mouth. Sophie sat across from her, curiosity clear in her expression. "How can I help you?" Sophie asked. Violet explained about the chest, the letters, and her uncle's connection to the blizzard. Sophie listened intently, her expression growing more amazed with each detail. "My great-grandparents, Charles and Helen, they were part of that rescue," Sophie said when Violet finished. "I heard the stories growing up. My great-grandmother especially loved to tell about that winter, about how the community came together." She paused. "But I never knew the young man they saved was your uncle." "He kept it quiet," Violet said, "but he never forgot." "Did your family ever receive any anonymous help over the years?" Sophie's expression grew thoughtful. "Actually, yes. About 6 years ago, we had a fire in the kitchen. Small one, but it destroyed most of our equipment. The insurance didn't cover replacement costs, and we were looking at closing down. My grandmother was heartbroken. This bakery was her life." She smiled sadly. "Then someone, we never found out who, sent us a check for $3,500. Enough to replace what we needed and get back on our feet. My uncle," Violet said softly. Really? Sophie's eyes filled with tears. My grandmother tried so hard to find out who'd helped us. She wanted to thank them, to pay them back somehow. She died not knowing. He wouldn't have wanted repayment, Violet said. He just wanted to help. Sophie wiped her eyes. That's incredibly kind. I wish we'd known. We could have. She stopped, shook her head. But I suppose that's not the point, is it? He helped because he wanted to, not because he expected anything back. They talked for another hour. Sophie sharing stories about her family and the bakery. Violet learning more about the Reeves family's struggles and triumphs. When Violet finally stood to leave, Sophie insisted she take a loaf of fresh bread and a box of pastries. No charge, Sophie said firmly when Violet tried to pay. Consider it thanks, even if it's late in coming. Outside the bakery, Violet stood on the sidewalk with her packages, thinking about the pattern emerging. Each family had received help at a crucial moment, help that had made the difference between survival and failure. And none of them had known where it came from. She still had two families to find, the Calloways and the Mercers. According to her notes, James Calloway ran the general store. It was just down the street, so she decided to visit now. The general store was one of the older buildings in town, a two-story structure with a covered boardwalk out front. Inside, it had the cluttered, comfortable feeling of a place that sold everything from nails to groceries to fishing lures. A man in his 60s stood behind the counter, tallying up purchases for a customer. Violet waited until the customer left, then approached the counter. Mr. Calloway? The man looked up, his weathered face breaking into a polite smile. That's me. What can I do for you? Violet introduced herself and explained why she'd come. James Calloway's expression shifted as he listened, moving from curiosity to recognition to something that might have been embarrassment. I remember the stories about the blizzard, he said slowly. My parents were John and Margaret Calloway. They passed years ago, but they always talked about helping that young man. He paused, his jaw tightening. Truth is, we weren't one of the families your uncle helped. Not directly anyway, Violet frowned. What do you mean? My parents, well, they had their reasons for not accepting help from anyone. Pride mostly. When times got tough, and they did get tough, they refused charity. He looked uncomfortable. Your uncle tried to help us years ago. Sent money through a lawyer, just like he did for the others. But my father sent it back. Said we didn't need handouts, that we'd manage on our own. I see, Violet said. Though she didn't, not really. We managed, James continued, but barely. Lost the family farm in the 90s. That's when I opened this store. It's been enough to get by, but nothing more. He met her eyes. I've always regretted my father's pride. We could have used that help. Maybe things would have been different. Violet thought about the ledger, about the entries marked with J. Calloway. There had been donations listed, but perhaps they'd been returned, as James said. Her uncle had tried to help, but pride had gotten in the way. Your family still saved his life, Violet said gently. That mattered to him, whether you accepted his help or not. James nodded slowly. I appreciate you telling me all this. It helps to know he remembered, even if things didn't work out the way he planned. After leaving the general store, Violet returned to the lodge feeling drained. She'd found 4 of the 5 families, learned their stories, seen how her uncle's quiet generosity had shaped their lives. But there was still one family left, the Mercers, who'd moved away decades ago. According to Susan's information, Lillian Mercer was in a nursing home 2 counties over. The drive would take several hours, and Violet wasn't sure she had the energy for it today. But she needed to complete the journey, needed to speak with all 5 families before she could decide what to do next. She spent that evening studying the ledger again, looking for the entries related to uncashed checks. Her uncle had written that he'd set aside $400,000 for the 5 families, money from investments he'd never touched. That money was supposed to go to them upon his death, distributed equally, but the lawyer hadn't contacted her about any distribution. Why not? What was she supposed to do with this information? The answer, she realized, was in her uncle's final letter. Violet will know what to do. He'd trusted her to figure it out, to understand what was needed and how to help. She pulled out her notebook and began making calculations. $400,000 divided by 5 families would be $80,000 each. Enough to save the Thornton farm from foreclosure. Enough to help Amy keep the clinic running. Enough to support Sophie's bakery and help James Calloway's store. And enough to ensure Lillian Mercer spent her final years in comfort. But could she just give it away? The money was technically part of her uncle's estate, which meant it was now hers. She could keep it, use it for her own needs, leave it to her children. Patricia would certainly tell her to do exactly that. Violet looked around the lodge, at the simple furnishings and worn floorboards, and thought about the man who'd lived here for 43 years. He'd had wealth but lived like he had nothing. He'd had opportunities to enjoy comfort but chose sacrifice instead. All because 5 families had shown him kindness during the worst moment of his life. She picked up the pocket watch from where it sat on the desk, reading the inscription again. Time repays all debts. Her uncle had spent 50 years repaying his debt. The least she could do was finish what he'd started. Violet woke the next morning to find the world transformed by fresh snow. At least 6 inches had fallen overnight, and it was still coming down steadily. She made coffee and sat by the window, watching Finn bound through the drifts in the yard, and decided she couldn't put off the trip to see Lillian Mercer any longer. The weather would only get worse as winter deepened, and she needed to complete her uncle's mission while she still could. But when she went out to start her car, she found all 4 tires had been slashed. Violet stood in the snow, staring at the damage, her heart pounding. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately vandalized her vehicle, and recently the cuts were clean and there was no snow inside the slashes. It must have happened during the night. She went back inside and called the only auto shop in town. The mechanic, a gruff man named Earl, said he could come out to look at it, but wouldn't be able to get replacement tires until next week at the earliest. He seemed unconcerned by her distress, almost as if he'd expected the call. After he hung up, Violet sat at the desk, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Someone didn't want her here. Someone was willing to damage her property to make that clear. But who and why now? She was still sitting there an hour later when she heard footsteps on the porch, followed by a heavy knock. Vin barked, and Violet approached the door cautiously. Through the window, she could see a man in his 50s standing on the porch, wearing the uniform of the Postal Service. She opened the door, but kept the screen latched. "Can I help you?" "Mrs. Marlowe?" the man said. His voice was clipped, official. "I'm Walter Henderson, the postmaster. I need to speak with you about some concerns that have been raised." Henderson. The same last name as Louise, the woman who'd brought the casserole. Violet's instincts told her to be careful. "What kind of concerns?" "May I come in? It's quite cold out here." Reluctantly, Violet unlatched the screen and stepped aside. Henderson entered, his eyes immediately scanning the interior of the lodge, taking in the chest by the fire, the papers on the desk, the photographs spread across the table. His gaze lingered on them a moment too long. "What's this about, Mr. Henderson?" Violet asked, staying near the door. Henderson turned to face her, his expression stern. "I've been hearing things around town about you asking questions, digging into old history, bothering local families with stories about your uncle. Some people are concerned about your motives." "My motives?" Violet felt anger rising. "I'm trying to understand my uncle's life." "What's wrong with that?" "Nothing necessarily," Henderson said, his tone suggesting otherwise. "But when you start telling people that Barnaby Marlowe was some kind of secret benefactor, that he was responsible for anonymous donations and mysterious help, well, that raises questions. Questions about his finances, about where that money came from, about whether it was even legal." "Are you accusing my uncle of something?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything," Henderson said smoothly. "But I am suggesting that you might want to be more careful about the stories you spread. Reputations matter in a small town, Mrs. Marlowe. Your uncle's and yours. Is that a threat?" Henderson's expression hardened. "It's advice. Good advice. Barnaby lived here for 40 years without causing trouble. It would be a shame if his memory was tarnished by wild claims and unfounded speculation." He moved toward the door, then paused. And while I'm here, I should mention my grandfather was also involved in that rescue back in 1975. The articles in the library don't tell the whole story. There were 6 families who helped that young man, not 5. My family was one of them. Violet frowned. I've read all the records. There were only 5 families mentioned. That's because the articles were written by people who wanted certain families to look good, Henderson said, bitterness creeping into his voice. My grandfather, Walter Henderson Sr., he was there. He helped. But when the time came to write it down for history, his name got left out. Politics, you might say. Some families were more prominent than others. What does that have to do with my uncle? Henderson's jaw tightened. Everything. Because when your uncle started his little charity operation, he chose to help only those 5 families. My family, the one that actually provided the cabin where they kept him warm, the one that gave him his first real job in this town, we got nothing. He ignored us completely. Understanding began to dawn on Violet. You think he owed your family something? I know he did, Henderson snapped. My grandfather tried to talk to him years ago. Tried to explain that we needed help too, that we'd been part of the rescue. But Barnaby refused. Said there were only 5 families involved, that my grandfather was lying. His face flushed with anger. My grandfather wasn't a liar, Mrs. Marlowe. He was a good man who got cheated out of recognition and support he deserved. I'm sorry your grandfather felt that way, Violet said carefully. But I can only go by what my uncle documented. He kept meticulous records, and records that conveniently leave my family out, Henderson interrupted. Records that have allowed those other families to benefit while mine has struggled. Do you know my father lost his business in the 80s? That we lost our family home? That my mother died waiting for medical treatment we couldn't afford? His voice rose. Meanwhile, the Thorntons got money for cancer treatment. The Reeves got their bakery equipment replaced. The Daltons got their land donated. All of them benefiting from your uncle's generosity, while my family got nothing. Violet felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Mr. Henderson, I understand you're upset, but upset? He laughed harshly. I'm not upset, Mrs. Marlowe. I'm telling you how things are. This town has protected those 5 families and their secret benefactor for decades. But now you're here, stirring things up, talking about your uncle's great legacy of kindness. Well, I want people to know the truth. I want them to know that Barnaby Marlowe wasn't a saint. He was a man who played favorites, who turned his back on people who'd helped him just as much as anyone else. That's not true, Violet said, though doubt was creeping in. Could her uncle have been wrong? Could there have been a 6th family? Henderson moved to the door, then turned back. I know about the money, Mrs. Marlowe. I know your uncle left a substantial sum for those 5 families. And I'm telling you now, if you try to distribute that money without including my family, I will take legal action. My grandfather deserved better than he got, and I intend to make sure his name is cleared. After Henderson left, Violet stood frozen in place, her mind racing. She needed to verify his claims, needed to know if there was any truth to his story. She called Susan at the library and asked if she could come look at the records again. Susan agreed, though she sounded puzzled by the urgency. An hour later, having convinced a neighbor to give her a ride into town, Violet was back in the library's archive room, searching through the materials she'd read before. Susan helped her, pulling out additional boxes of materials, town council minutes, personal diaries donated to the historical collection, old letters. After 2 hours of searching, they found something. A journal entry from someone named Alice Porter, dated February 1975, that mentioned the rescue. 6 families worked together to save the young stranger, it read. The Callaways, Thorntons, Daltons, Reeves, Mercers, and Hendersons all took turns caring for him. 6 families. But when they looked at the newspaper articles and official accounts published years later, only 5 families were named. The Henderson name had been deliberately omitted. Why would they leave one family out? Violet asked Susan. The librarian looked uncomfortable. I remember hearing something about this years ago. There was a scandal involving the Henderson family in the early 80s. Walter Henderson Sr. was accused of fraud, something about taking money meant for community projects and using it for himself. He was never formally charged, but the town sort of shunned him after that. Maybe that's why his name got removed from the official history. But that happened years after the rescue, Violet said. It shouldn't have changed what they did in 1975. No, it shouldn't have, Susan agreed. But small towns have long memories. When someone's reputation is damaged, people tend to rewrite history to match how they feel about them in the present. Violet left the library with photocopies of the journal entries, her mind troubled. If the Hendersons had truly been part of the rescue, then her uncle had been wrong to exclude them from his help. But why would he have done that? Barnaby's records were meticulous, his research thorough. He wouldn't have simply overlooked an entire family. Back at the lodge, with Finn at her feet and the fire burning low, Violet searched through the chest and the ledger again, looking for any mention of the Henderson family. She found it on one of the last pages of the ledger, a single entry dated June 1982. W. Henderson Sr. approached me today demanding money. Claims his family helped during the rescue and deserves compensation. Investigated his claims. Spoke with the original 5 families. All confirmed. Henderson was not involved in the rescue efforts. He provided temporary shelter for 2 days, but demanded payment for it at the time, and was compensated by the town. His current claims are an attempt to extort money based on a false narrative. I cannot and will not support dishonesty. Informed him of my decision. He threatened legal action and retaliation. Below that, in darker ink as if added later, was another note. Henderson has been spreading lies about my charity work in town, trying to damage my reputation. He wants money he believes I owe him, but I will not reward manipulation and falsehood. The 5 families who saved me know the truth. That is enough. Violet sat back, processing this new information. Her uncle had investigated Walter Henderson Sr.'s claims and found them false. The man had provided shelter briefly, but had been paid for it, and his subsequent demands for ongoing support were based on lies he'd told himself and others. But now his grandson was in a position of influence in the town, serving as postmaster, controlling communication, and he'd inherited his grandfather's resentment. That would explain the slashed tires, the break-in, the missing letters. Henderson was trying to intimidate her, trying to stop her from honoring her uncle's wishes. The question was, what should she do about it? The next morning, Violet called the lawyer who had handled her uncle's estate. His name was Gerald Pemberton, and his office was in the valley town of Ridgemont, about an hour's drive from Silverpine Ridge. She explained the situation, the uncashed checks, the 5 families, the Henderson claims, and her desire to honor her uncle's wishes. Pemberton listened carefully, then said, "Mrs. Marlowe, I need you to come to my office. There are documents you need to see, and we need to discuss the legal implications of what you're proposing." With her car still waiting for new tires, Violet arranged for a ride with Sophie Reeves, who had offered to help when she'd stopped by the bakery the day before. Sophie drove carefully through the snowy roads, and they reached Pemberton's office just after noon. The lawyer was a man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a methodical manner. He spread several documents across his desk as Violet and Sophie sat across from him. "Your uncle came to see me 6 months before he died," Pemberton began. "He knew his health was failing, and he wanted to make arrangements. The official will leave everything to you, the lodge, his personal belongings, his savings account. But he also left this." He slid a handwritten document across the desk. Violet picked it up. It was titled Addendum to Last Will and Testament, and was written in her uncle's careful script. "To my niece Violet," it read, "I leave the responsibility I have carried for 50 years. The enclosed funds, approximately $400,000 in uncashed dividend, checks and investment returns, are to be distributed equally among the 5 families who saved my life in 1975, the Callaways, Thorntons, Daltons, Reeves, and Mercers. I trust you to ensure this distribution happens fairly and with the discretion I maintained throughout my life." You are under no legal obligation to honor this request, but I hope you will understand why it matters. These families gave me everything when they had little to spare. Time has repaid my debt, but only if you complete this final act. With love and gratitude, Barnaby. Violet's hands trembled as she read. Is this legally binding? Pemberton nodded slowly. It is if you choose to honor it. The official will give you full control of the estate. This addendum is more of a moral directive than a legal requirement. You could keep the money if you wanted. No court would stop you. But if you choose to distribute it as your uncle requested, I can facilitate that through the trust I've already established. What about the Henderson claim? Violet asked. Walter Henderson says his grandfather was part of the rescue and that his family deserves a share. Pemberton's expression hardened. I know all about the Henderson claim. Walter Henderson Sr. came to see your uncle multiple times over the years, demanding money. Your uncle documented every interaction. Henderson Sr. was not involved in the rescue beyond providing temporary shelter for which he was paid. His subsequent claims were false, designed to extract money through intimidation. He paused. His grandson, the current postmaster, has inherited both the false narrative and the resentment. I've received several calls from him threatening legal action if he's not included in any distribution. Can he actually sue? Sophie asked, speaking for the first time. He can try, Pemberton said, but he has no legal standing. The addendum clearly specifies 5 families, and there's extensive documentation proving those 5 were the legitimate rescuers. Henderson's threats are empty, legally speaking, but they can still cause trouble, harassment, defamation, making life difficult for you and the families involved. Violet sat back in her chair, overwhelmed. She'd come to Silverpine Ridge, expecting to simply sell a lodge and return to her quiet life. Instead, she'd uncovered a 50-year story of kindness and obligation, and now she was being asked to carry it forward while facing threats from someone determined to rewrite history. What do you think I should do? She asked Pemberton. The lawyer considered carefully before answering. Legally, you have clear grounds to proceed with the distribution as your uncle requested. Morally, that seems to be what you want to do. The question is whether you're prepared for the conflict that will follow. Walter Henderson won't accept this quietly. He'll make accusations, spread rumors, possibly escalate to harassment or worse. He looked at her seriously. You need to decide if you're willing to stand up to that. Violet thought about her uncle, about the young man half frozen in a cabin, saved by people who owed him nothing. She thought about 50 years of quiet generosity, of promises kept in secret, of a life lived in service to a debt of gratitude. And she thought about her own life, 80 years of playing it safe, of avoiding conflict, of taking the easy path. I'll do it, she said firmly. I'll honor my uncle's wishes. Whatever Henderson does, we'll deal with it. Pemberton nodded with what looked like approval. Then we should move quickly. I'll begin the paperwork for the distribution. You'll need to inform the families, explain what's happening. And we should do this publicly, a community announcement of some kind. That will make it harder for Henderson to twist the narrative. A community meeting. Violet suggested. Exactly. Invite the 5 families, invite anyone interested in your uncle's story. Make the truth public before Henderson can poison it with lies. He pulled out a calendar. How soon can you arrange it? The community center at the old schoolhouse, Sophie interjected. I know Emma, the woman who runs programs there. She could arrange it. Maybe this Saturday? That gives us 5 days. Violet felt a flutter of anxiety. 5 days to prepare, to gather the families, to stand in front of the community and tell her uncle's story. 5 days before Walter Henderson found out what she was planning and tried to stop her. Saturday it is, she said. The ride back to Silverpine Ridge was quiet. Sophie seemed to sense that Violet needed time to think. When they pulled up to the lodge, Sophie touched her arm gently. You're doing the right thing, she said. My great-grandparents would have been proud to know what Barnaby did, how he honored their kindness. And my grandmother, she died wondering who'd helped us when we needed it most. This will give her memory peace, even if she's not here to see it. After Sophie left, Violet went inside and began preparing. She would need to contact all 5 families, explain what was happening, invite them to the meeting. She would need to organize her uncle's documents, prepare copies of the key pieces, the ledger, the letters, the photographs, and she would need to steel herself for whatever Walter Henderson would throw at her. That evening, she began making phone calls. Robert Thornton was grateful and relieved, saying the money would save his farm. Amy Dalton was moved to tears, saying it would allow her to expand the clinic's services. Sophie Reeves, of course, already knew. James Calloway was quiet when she called, then said simply, "My father was a proud fool. I'm grateful Barnaby saw past that." The hardest call was to the nursing home where Lillian Mercer lived. When Violet explained who she was and why she was calling, there was a long pause before the nurse said, "Mrs. Mercer doesn't have many visitors. She'll be so happy to hear from someone who knew her late husband. Can you hold while I get her to the phone?" Minutes later, a thin, elderly voice came on the line. "Hello, this is Lillian Mercer." Violet introduced herself and explained about Barnaby, about the rescue, about the 50 years of quiet help. She heard Lillian's breath catch, heard the tears in her voice as she said, "Martin and I always wondered what happened to that young man. We hoped he'd found a good life. To know he remembered us, that he spent his life honoring what we did. Oh, my dear, that's more than we ever expected. He left something for you and your family," Violet said gently. "Enough to make sure you're comfortable for whatever time remains." Lillian was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I don't need money, dear. Just knowing he remembered is gift enough. But if there are funds, please use them for our great-grandchildren. They're struggling, trying to make their way. That would honor Martin's memory better than anything." After hanging up, Violet sat at the desk, with tears streaming down her face. These were good people, people who'd shown extraordinary kindness half a century ago and never asked for recognition or reward. They deserved to know what their actions had meant, deserved to receive the gift her uncle had so carefully preserved for them. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Violet worked with Emma at the community center to arrange the meeting space. She organized her uncle's documents, made copies of everything important. She wrote and rewrote what she would say, trying to find words that would do justice to Barnaby's story, and she waited for Henderson's response. It came on Thursday, 2 days before the scheduled meeting. She found a letter taped to her door, written in angry, slashing script. "Mrs. Marlowe, I know what you're planning. You think you can honor your uncle by spreading lies about my family, by denying us what we're owed. I'm warning you, if you proceed with this distribution without including the Henderson family, I will sue you, the estate, and every family involved. I will make sure everyone in this town knows what kind of people you all really are. This is your last chance to do the right thing." Violet crumpled the letter and threw it in the fire. She'd made her decision, and she would stand by it. Saturday would come, the truth would be told, and Walter Henderson would have to accept it. On Friday evening, the night before the meeting, Violet sat by the fire with Finn at her feet, holding her uncle's pocket watch. She could almost feel his presence in the lodge, could almost hear his quiet voice telling her she was doing the right thing. "Time repays all debts," she whispered, reading the inscription once more. "I'll finish this for you, Uncle Barnaby. I promise." Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle and steady, covering the world in white. Tomorrow would be difficult, but she was ready. She had the truth on her side, and the backing of 5 families who'd shown what real kindness looked like. Whatever happened, she would honor her uncle's legacy and complete the mission he'd spent 50 years pursuing. The watch ticked steadily in her hand, marking time, counting down to the moment when secrets would become public, when debts would be acknowledged, and when a quiet man's extraordinary life would finally be understood by the community he'd served in silence. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and bitter cold. Violet dressed carefully, choosing her best wool dress and her uncle's coat for warmth. She gathered the documents she'd prepared, copies of the letters, the ledger, the photographs, and placed them in a worn leather satchel that had belonged to Barnaby. Finn seemed to sense the importance of the day, staying close to her as she moved through the lodge, his dark eyes watchful and concerned. Sophie arrived at 10 to drive her to the community center. "The place is already filling up," she said, as Violet climbed into the car. Word spread fast. "Half the town must be coming." Violet's stomach tightened with nerves, but she nodded. This was what needed to happen. The truth couldn't stay buried anymore. The old schoolhouse looked different than it had during her first visit. Cars filled the yard, and people clustered on the porch, talking in low voices. As Violet approached with Sophie and Finn, the conversations died down, heads turning to watch her. She recognized some faces from town: the librarian Susan, the mechanic Earl, Louise Henderson from the cafe. And at the back of the crowd, arms crossed and expression dark, stood Walter Henderson. Inside, the main room had been arranged with rows of chairs facing a small raised platform where Emma had set up a microphone and a projector screen. The 5 families sat in the front rows: Robert Thornton with his wife and children, Amy Dalton with her teenage son, Sophie and her mother from the bakery, James Calloway looking uncomfortable in a suit and, having made the journey at Violet's invitation, Lillian Mercer in a wheelchair, pushed by a younger woman Violet assumed was her granddaughter. Violet made her way to the platform, her legs shaking slightly. Gerald Pemberton was already there, setting up his own documents on a small table. He gave her an encouraging nod. Emma stepped to the microphone first. "Thank you all for coming. We're gathered today to hear about Barnaby Marlowe and his connection to our community. Mrs. Marlowe, his niece, has some information to share that I think will surprise and move all of you. Mrs. Marlowe." Violet took her place at the microphone, looking out at the crowd of perhaps 70 people. She saw curiosity on most faces, skepticism on others, and outright hostility on Walter Henderson's. She took a deep breath and began. "Thank you for coming. I know many of you didn't know my uncle well. He lived here for 43 years, but he kept to himself, and I suspect most of you thought of him as just another mountain recluse. I thought the same thing until recently." Her voice was steadier than she'd expected. "But 3 weeks ago, I discovered something that changed everything I knew about Uncle Barnaby." She told them about Finn finding the chest, about the letters and photographs inside, about the map marking 5 locations around town. As she spoke, Emma projected images on the screen, photos of the letters, the ledger pages, the pictures from 1975. "In the winter of that year," Violet continued, "during the worst blizzard this region had ever seen, a young man nearly died in an abandoned cabin. 5 families found him and saved his life. They were the Calloways, the Thorntons, the Daltons, the Reeves, and the Mercers. That young man was my uncle." She paused, letting that sink in. She could see surprise on faces throughout the room, people leaning forward with renewed interest. My uncle never forgot what those families did for him. He spent the next 50 years repaying their kindness, quietly and anonymously. When families struggled, he helped. When they faced crisis, he stepped in. He lived simply so he could give more away. He asked for nothing in return, wanted no recognition, just wanted to honor the debt he felt he owed. Violet displayed the photographs of her uncle as a young man, nearly dead from exposure, being helped by the 5 families. Several people in the audience gasped. In the front row, Lillian Mercer was crying quietly, her granddaughter holding her hand. "The community center where we're sitting right now," Violet said, "was funded by my uncle. The medical clinic by the river stands on land he donated. The Thornton family received help with medical bills when their grandfather had cancer. The Reeves bakery got money to replace equipment after a fire. Again and again, over 50 years, my uncle helped these families and asked nothing in return." She showed them pages from the ledger, the careful documentation of every gift given, every need met. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone transfixed by the story unfolding before them. "My uncle left instructions in his will," Violet said, her voice growing stronger. "He set aside $400,000, money he earned through careful investment and saving, money he never spent on himself, to be distributed equally among the 5 families who saved his life. It was his final gift, his way of saying thank you one last time." She looked directly at the 5 families in the front row. "You didn't know what your kindness meant. You probably never thought about it again after that winter ended. But my uncle thought about it every day for 50 years. You gave him his life back when you had every reason to focus on your own survival. That kind of gift can never truly be repaid, but he spent his whole life trying. Robert Thornton was crying openly now. Amy Dalton had her face in her hands. Sophie's mother clutched her daughter's arm, both of them stunned. James Calloway stared at the floor, his jaw working. And Lillian Mercer, despite her tears, was smiling. Then Walter Henderson stood up. "That's a beautiful story, Mrs. Marlowe," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Very touching. But it's incomplete." He pushed his way toward the front of the room. "You're telling everyone about 5 families, but you're deliberately leaving out a 6th. My grandfather, Walter Henderson Sr., was also involved in that rescue. He provided the cabin where your uncle stayed. He gave him food and clothing. He deserves to be recognized, and my family deserves a share of that money." A murmur ran through the crowd. Violet felt her heart pounding but forced herself to remain calm. "Mr. Henderson," she said quietly, "I've researched your grandfather's involvement. He did provide temporary shelter, that's true, but he was compensated for it by the town at the time. The 5 families I mentioned took my uncle into their homes, cared for him for weeks without payment, and helped him get back on his feet. That's the difference." Henderson's face flushed red. "You're calling my grandfather a liar." "I'm stating facts based on my uncle's documentation," Violet said. She nodded to Emma, who projected a new image, the page from Barnaby's ledger detailing his investigation of Henderson Sr.'s claims. "My uncle investigated your grandfather's story in 1982. He spoke with all 5 families, verified the facts, and concluded that your grandfather was trying to extort money based on a false narrative." "That's slander," Henderson shouted. "My grandfather was a good man who got cheated out of recognition he deserved. Your uncle was the liar, not him." Gerald Pemberton stood up. "Mr. Henderson, I have documented proof of every interaction between your grandfather and Barnaby Marlowe. Your grandfather demanded money repeatedly over a 20-year period. He threatened Barnaby, spread rumors about him, and tried to damage his reputation when he didn't get what he wanted. This is all documented and witnessed." Henderson turned to face the crowd. "Don't you see what they're doing? They're protecting the so-called good families while smearing mine. My grandfather told me the truth before he died. He helped save that man's life, and he got nothing for it, while these others got rich from secret handouts." Susan Fletcher, the librarian, stood up. "Walter, I have the historical records. I've read the journals and accounts from 1975. Your grandfather provided 2 days of shelter and was paid by the town relief fund. The 5 families Mrs. Marlowe mentioned cared for the young man for nearly a month. Those are the facts." "Facts can be manipulated," Henderson spat. "Records can be changed. This whole town has been protecting this lie for 50 years because it makes certain families look good. Well, I'm not going to stand for it anymore. If Mrs. Marlowe proceeds with this distribution without including my family, I will take legal action against everyone involved." The room erupted in conversation, people arguing, voices rising. Violet felt control of the meeting slipping away. This was exactly what Henderson wanted: chaos, doubt, confusion. She had to regain control somehow, had to find a way to make the truth clear beyond any question. That's when Lillian Mercer spoke. The elderly woman's voice was thin, but carried clearly in the sudden quiet. "Young man, I was there. I remember everything about that winter, and I remember your grandfather." Henderson turned to face her, his expression uncertain. "Mrs. Mercer, with all respect, you're 95 years old. Your memory—" "My memory is sharp as it ever was," Lillian interrupted, steel in her frail voice. "And I remember your grandfather demanding money from the town for 2 days of shelter he provided to that young man. He got it too, $50, which was a lot of money back then. The rest of us took care of that boy for weeks without asking for a cent, because that's what neighbors do." She looked around the room, her gaze taking in everyone present. "My husband Martin and we fed him when we barely had enough for ourselves. The Calloways shared their medical supplies. The Thorntons gave him clothes. The Daltons let him stay in their barn until he was well enough to work. The Reeves taught him how to bake bread so he could earn money. We all helped because it was the right thing to do, not because we expected payment. Henderson opened his mouth to protest, but Lillian wasn't finished. Your grandfather, Walter, he was a hard man, always looking for an angle, always wanting to profit. When he heard years later that some of us had received anonymous help during tough times, he tried to claim he deserved the same. But he hadn't done what we did. He'd been paid for his small part, and that was fair. What happened after? That was a gift from someone who understood the difference between obligation and kindness. The room was utterly silent. Lillian's granddaughter wheeled her closer to the front, and the elderly woman looked directly at Walter Henderson. Your grandfather poisoned you with his bitterness, she said, not unkindly. He couldn't accept that he wasn't part of something special, so he spent years trying to take credit for what others did. I'm sorry for that. It must be hard to carry that resentment. But it doesn't change the truth. 5 families saved that young man's life. Your grandfather provided temporary shelter for which he was compensated. Those are the facts, and no amount of anger will change them. Henderson stood frozen, his face white with emotion. The room waited for his response. For a long moment he seemed to struggle with himself, pride warring with the undeniable weight of Lillian's testimony. Then, without a word, he turned and pushed his way through the crowd toward the exit. As the door slammed behind him, the tension in the room broke. People began talking again, but the tone had changed. No longer argumentative, but amazed, moved by what they'd heard. Violet stepped back to the microphone, her hands steadier now. There's more you should know. Mr. Henderson filed a complaint alleging my uncle engaged in illegal financial activities. The estate has been frozen. But I want to show you the truth. Pemberton began projecting tax records, bank statements, investment documents onto the screen. Every donation tracked and reported. Every tax paid on schedule. 50 years of meticulous documentation, proving that Barnaby Marlowe had done everything legally, transparently, and with careful integrity. My uncle was not a criminal, Violet said firmly. He was a man who understood the debt he owed, and spent his entire life repaying it. He lived in a drafty lodge with a leaking roof, drove an old car, wore patched clothes, all so he could give more to the families who'd saved him. Susan Fletcher, the librarian, stood up. I have records at the library documenting the 1975 rescue. 5 families are named in contemporary accounts. Henderson Sr. is not among them. I also checked the town's relief fund records from that winter. He received $50 for temporary shelter provided. That's the only documentation of his involvement. One by one, other townspeople began to stand. A woman Violet didn't recognize spoke up. My mother received help from an anonymous donor 20 years ago when my father died suddenly. We never knew who it was. Was that Mr. Marlowe? Violet checked the ledger quickly. What was your mother's name? Margaret Calloway. Violet nodded, her throat tight. Yes, my uncle helped her through that difficult time. Another person stood. The community center where my children go after school, the renovations that saved that building. Was that him too? Yes. The testimonies continued, each one adding another layer to the portrait of Barnaby Marlowe. People sharing stories of anonymous help, mysterious donations that appeared exactly when needed, support that had arrived without explanation. All of it pointing back to one quiet man on a mountain who'd never asked for recognition or gratitude. Robert Thornton stood, his voice thick with emotion. My grandfather died of cancer 12 years ago. He lived 4 extra years because someone paid for his treatment when we couldn't afford it. I have children who got to know their great-grandfather because of Barnaby Marlowe. They have memories of him teaching them to fish, telling them stories. That's worth more than any amount of money could ever be. Amy Dalton spoke next, wiping tears from her eyes. The clinic where I work exists because someone donated the land my mother needed. We've treated hundreds of people over 20 years, people who couldn't afford the 40-mile drive to the nearest hospital. How many lives has that clinic saved? How many children received care they wouldn't have gotten otherwise? Sophie Reeves added, Our bakery has been part of this town for 56 years. It employs 6 people. It supports families. After the fire 6 years ago, we would have closed forever. But someone helped us rebuild, and now we're still here, still serving this community. The room had transformed completely. What had begun as a defensive presentation against false accusations had become a celebration of an extraordinary life quietly lived. 3 weeks later, Violet stood in Gerald Pemberton's office as he distributed checks to the 5 families. $80,000 each, carefully divided from the $400,000 her uncle had saved over decades. The families accepted them with tears and overwhelming gratitude, but more importantly, with deep understanding of what the gifts truly represented. "It's not really about the money," Robert Thornton said quietly, holding the check with reverent care. "It's knowing that what my grandparents did mattered, that their simple act of kindness echoed forward through 50 years and changed someone's entire life." Amy Dalton nodded, wiping her eyes. "My mother used to say that helping people was its own reward." She believed that so deeply. Now I know she was absolutely right. The reward isn't money or public recognition. It's knowing you've genuinely made a difference in someone's life. Sophie Reeves smiled through her tears. "My great-grandparents would be so moved by all of this. They helped a stranger in desperate need, never expecting anything in return, and it changed the entire course of his life. That's genuinely incredible." Even James Calloway, whose father's stubborn pride had prevented their family from accepting direct help years ago, seemed philosophical. "My father made his choices based on what he believed was right. But Mr. Marlowe tried to help us anyway. He honored what my grandparents did during that rescue, even when my father wouldn't let him support us. That says everything about his character." Lillian Mercer, present through a video call from the nursing home, smiled gently through her tears. "Martin and I were just doing what any decent neighbors should do. But knowing it meant so much to that young man, knowing he carried that gratitude for 50 years, that's a gift beyond any measure. Please use my share for my great-grandchildren's education. That's what would make Martin proudest." After the distributions were finalized, Violet returned to the lodge, with Finn trotting faithfully beside her. The place felt fundamentally different now, warmer somehow, despite the lingering cold outside. She'd made her decision. She wouldn't sell the lodge. Instead, she would stay, at least for a good while longer. The lodge was an essential part of her uncle's story, and now it had become part of her own story too. She'd also decided what to do with her own inheritance, the lodge itself. The modest savings account, the small amount remaining after the distributions to the 5 families. She would use everything to establish a foundation in her uncle's name, the Barnaby Marlowe Community Fund. It would continue his life's work, helping families in need throughout Silverpine Ridge and the surrounding area, always quietly, always without any expectation of recognition or repayment. Sophie had enthusiastically agreed to help run the foundation's daily operations. Amy would serve on the advisory board. Robert, James, and several others from the community had volunteered their time and expertise. Even Susan Fletcher from the library had offered to help research families who might need assistance, maintaining the same discretion Barnaby had practiced. The town's attitude toward Violet had shifted completely and permanently. Where before she'd faced skepticism, pity, and barely concealed condescension, now she encountered genuine respect and warmth wherever she went. People stopped her on Main Street to thank her personally, to share their own stories of how Barnaby had quietly helped them or their families over the years. Even Louise Henderson had apologized tearfully for her husband's terrible behavior and brought Violet a peace offering of fresh apple pie. Walter Henderson himself had left town entirely, moving to stay with relatives in another county while he faced criminal charges for the vandalism and filing a false complaint. His wife had filed for divorce, according to the gossip Violet occasionally heard at the general store. The Henderson family's desperate attempts to claim a false legacy had backfired spectacularly and publicly, but Violet took no satisfaction or pleasure in Henderson's downfall. She understood in a deeper way what had truly driven him. The heavy burden of inherited resentment, the crushing weight of family stories that may or may not have been entirely true, the desperate human need to claim significance and recognition. It was genuinely sad. If Henderson Sr. had simply been honest about his small role in the rescue, if he'd accepted that he'd been compensated fairly for the limited shelter he'd provided, none of this ugliness would have happened. Spring came surprisingly early to Silverpine Ridge that year. By mid-March, the heavy snow had begun melting steadily, gradually revealing the brown earth beneath. Violet spent her days organizing the foundation, carefully going through her uncle's remaining papers and taking long, peaceful walks with Finn through the slowly awakening forest. She'd also reconnected meaningfully with Patricia and Michael. Her children had been deeply skeptical at first, genuinely worried about their 80-year-old mother staying alone in the mountains. But when she'd explained everything, the buried chest, the decades of letters, the remarkable legacy, the new foundation, they'd finally understood. Patricia had even offered to help with the legal paperwork. Michael had promised to visit during the summer with his whole family. One peaceful afternoon in late March, Violet sat on the porch with hot tea, watching Finn chase butterflies in the greening yard. She pulled out the silver pocket watch from her cardigan pocket, the one she'd found in her uncle's nightstand. The inscription caught the afternoon sunlight. Time repays all debts. She finally understood completely what her uncle had meant. Not that time somehow erases what we owe others, but that it gives us the precious opportunity to repay our debts through action. Her uncle had been given 50 years to honor his debt of gratitude, and he'd used every single day purposefully. Now Violet had been given her own opportunity, not to repay a debt of survival, but to honor a profound debt of memory and love. Her uncle had trusted her with his remarkable story, with his carefully built legacy, with the completion of his entire life's work. And she would spend whatever time remained to her, making absolutely sure that sacred trust was not misplaced. The 5 families had planted a beautiful tree at the community center in Barnaby's honor. A strong silver maple, enduring and graceful, with a bronze plaque that read, "In memory of Barnaby Marlowe, who understood that kindness is a debt that can never be fully repaid, but must always be honored with our whole hearts." Violet had cried openly at the dedication ceremony. Surrounded by the families her uncle had helped for decades, by the community he'd served faithfully in secret, by people who finally understood what an extraordinary man had lived quietly among them all those years. As twilight settled gently over the mountains, Violet smiled, watching the last light fade behind the peaks. She understood now. The greatest legacy anyone can leave isn't money or property or even recognition. It's the living example of a life well lived in genuine service to others. The pocket watch ticked steadily on, marking time, counting forward. And Violet knew that whatever time she had left, she would use it well, because time repays all debts, if we're brave enough to honor them.